So earlier I alluded to the concept, the idea that auto incentives are back. Whether it be dealer cash back or discounts. But the 7.1% financing is weakening deals for buyers and causing them to stretch into longer loans and to higher payments. $738 for a new car is the average payment now. Same thing's happening in the mortgage industry as we went from near zero interest rates to getting a 30-year mortgage around 7%, a little higher, 7.5%. It was a rapid change going from a 30-year mortgage at 3.5, sometimes less than 3, up to 4, 5, 6, and 7%. It's changed the landscape. The median price of Bay Area home was up more than 15% from a year ago. I saw Barbara Corcoran from the Shark Tank. She said something pretty interesting at a speech recently. She said, if you wait for interest rates to come down by another point, I don't think you'll gain. I think you'll wind up paying more, a lot more. I wouldn't be surprised if real estate went up another 8 to 10% if rates continue to come down 1 full point. Joining me today, Mr. Mortgage Man, Scott. I call you Mr. Mortgage Man. You have a website, mrmortgageman.com. It's mrmortgageman.com. Real simple. People can contact me if they can't remember it. Scott, what are your thoughts on Barbara Corcoran talking about act now or see higher prices?
Yeah, well, she was really just talking about today. There's like 5 buyers for every house. Yep. And if the rates were to come down even that 1 point so the competition, like those people that have been sitting on the sidelines, they just decide to jump in to get a house. More competition will inevitably increase, the home prices.
Yeah. It's a weird teeter-totter. And I tend to say, find the dream house, find what you want, potentially get into it if you can afford the monthly payments. And as interest rates come down, potentially refinance. So I'm not against using a short-term product, which has never actually been short in my life, like 5 or 7 year ARMs. Anytime I've bought a house, I've refinanced it within 2, 3, 4 years. So I should have gone with a shorter term, lower payment. Scott, what are your thoughts on buying outside of the direct Bay Area? Maybe like Solano County, where cheaper housing exists and many Bay Area workers are commuting from there already.
With home prices in the Bay Area, it's definitely like a viable option for a couple reasons. The affordability, as I mentioned, commute, like if you're in Solano or San Joaquin counties, for example, your commute's really not that bad, and you'd be saving quite a bit on your housing costs. And then lastly, buying out of the Bay Area could be a really good investment. As people move out of the Bay Area, those neighboring counties have been growing. So it could be a really good investment.
Yeah. I once had a listener of the show. He was a police officer in Oakland. And he goes, Rob, I can't afford a house where I work. What should I do? And I said, where are you going to retire? He said, Tampa. I said, have you considered buying a house in Tampa, renting it out for the next 10, 15 years until you hit retirement and just rent here? And he never thought of it. It was kind of an alternative way of thinking. He did it. He appreciates it. It ended up pretty well for him. What are your thoughts about being maybe a renter in the Bay Area, as some people are stuck in that, and buying investment property outside like the police officer did? It's an interesting theory, right? It's not what mom and dad taught us.
Well, again, going back to that word affordability,
yep.
Buying outside the Bay Area, your money's just going to go farther. And so if you're like renting that property out, you could have positive cash flow literally from day one, which, could either help pay your rent, pay your mortgage, and then it'll allow you to buy a home where it's not guaranteed, but appreciation in that home could also be a pretty nice nest egg for that police officer in your example when they retire.
It's all good stuff. And before you came on in my last segment, I talked about how real estate historically for the last 85 years has averaged 4.4% of the United States, in the Bay Area a little bit more. But at that rate of return, you would double your money on the home in about 14 years, a little less than 14 years. So people should think about it. So I still think it's a good idea to own real estate if you're going to be around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Any final thoughts from you as I plug you on your way out?
No, I think just going back to if you're thinking outside the Bay Area, like there's some places closer than you think that could be in great investment opportunities. Sacramento, even across the bridge in Oakland and Richmond, right? Like these cities are a little bit less expensive, but really close for commutes.
And to give you an idea, back in the late 80s and the early 90s when I was in New York, there's a part of the city called Hell's Kitchen. And it had high crime and it had high poverty. It was not a lot and easy to look for the eyes, but the people that snapped up properties then, it's gentrified. And that's probably a bad word in a lot of people's minds, but it's safe now and it's high-end shopping now. And it was a great investment when you could. So sometimes you got to think outside the box of your dream home. And sometimes you have to think, let's get the dream home and refinance later. If you want to talk about these kind of options and or more, reach out to Scott Thompson. He's a friend of mine. We will do dinner sometime this summer as life's slow down from our kids in school. You can find him at mrmortgageman.com. That's MR, mortgage, MORTGAGE, man, MAN.com, mrmortgageman.com. That's Scott Thompson. Thanks for joining us. Now, back to the stock market, which is kind of my area. I can't talk real estate, so I bring on people that can. I can talk real estate, big picture, but he's kind of a bullet shot into real estate and into mortgages and what you qualify for and what you don't. So I'm with Barbara Corcoran. I think mortgage homes go up 7-8% as interest rates fall back to the sixes. They're in the sevens now, low sevens. Maybe sometimes you can get in the high sixes, but if we go to the low sixes, I think you're going to see a lot of buyers come out of the market and push prices higher. I do think we've pulled some of real estate gains forward, but that doesn't mean much these days. The S&P 500 is sitting at record highs. It's up 11 points for the day, up 0.25%. I wouldn't be surprised if we close lower for the day. Sometimes Wall Street gets into this kind of celebratory, hey, we hit an all-time high. And the Dow hit 40,000. That's a big round number. If I were to be on television tonight for the news, they would say, hey, can you talk about 40,000? And I'd go on and I'd say, I think the Dow is going to be at 80,000 in 7.2 years. And they'd be like, what? And I'm like, that's just doing what it's always done. Doubled every 7.2 years. So I don't like big round numbers, but they are kind of fun to look at. I like big round numbers. I cannot lie. I'm not going to go into rapping, but I want to. The NASDAQ up 30 points today, up 1/5%. So that's a little tired. It opened higher and it's going a little bit lower. Interesting to note. Now, this is all in the backdrop of the 10-year Treasury as well, ticking down to 4.36%. Earlier this week, we saw some weakness in the PPI and CPI numbers. Weakness as far as the inflation wasn't as bad as we were expecting. In fact, the numbers looked a little bit better. So after 3 rough months of hotter than expected reads on inflation, we got one that was cooler than expected. Is that reason to party? No. Honestly, if you were to put a gun to my head and say, Rob, we're forcing you into retirement, you've got cancer of the teeth, they're all going to fall out and you can't talk anymore, I'd be, well, I'm just going to buy the S&P 500 and go away. Not quite that simple. Not quite that simple, but you get the idea of where I'm going for with this. Diversification is about decades. I talked about this yesterday, and I want to hit it one more time. In the 1970s, the top countries as far as return for those 10-year periods were Japan, Canada, France, Germany, UK, Sweden, and US. The US in the 1970s only returned 76%, whereas Japan returned 396%. In the 1980s, top countries were Sweden, Japan, Italy, Spain, UK, France, then the USA, with Sweden returning 1,248% and the United States up just 404% during that 10-year period. Now, again, money is only supposed to double every 10 years. So it didn't double in the 70s, but it did double in the 80s, more than doubled. Then you turn the page to the 1990s when the internet started coming in. When Clinton did the banking deregulation, where banks were allowed to become brokers, brokers were allowed to become insurance agents, insurance was allowed to become banks. They all get into each other's. There was a lot of deregulation, is what I'm trying to get at. In the 1990s, the U.S. was the number 2 country behind Sweden. And remember how I talked about Japan in the 1970s being the winner chicken dinner in the 70s and 80s? Up 396% in the 70s, up 1,100% in the 80s. Japan was down 7% for that 10-year period in the 90s. In the 2000s, Japan was down 30%. In the 2010s, Japan got better, up 92%. So in the last 2 years, the United States have been the top market. The last 2 decades, the United States have been the top. So the 2020s and the 2010s. Do I expect the U.S. to be the top market in the 2030s? I do not. Because if you look back just right now, 50 years, 60 years, you can see that no country was dominant for more than 3 years. No country was dominant for more than 2 decades. So diversification is about decades. You can find me online at Rob Black Show, Twitter Rob Black Show, YouTube Rob Black Show. Going to be doing a Pints and Portfolio in June. You can learn more about that at robblackshow.com. If you want me to review your portfolio and schedule a Zoom call for you, I'll do that. Give you 30, 40 minutes on Zoom to talk about, are you ready to retire? That's what the whole Zoom call would be about. Are you there? Checklist, kind of. Check out and drop me an email, rob@robblackshow.com.